The global economy is in chaos in 2022, and as we are approaching the year end, the most frequently asked question is, where are we going from here, and what will this recession look like?
I think you're absolutely right to use the word recession. It is our expectation that global growth in 2023 will be quite a bit softer than we've seen in 2022. We do expect a recession in major economies like the UK, the euro area, and a mild recession in the United States. I think what this discussion ignores, though, is that there will still be some very good pockets of growth around the world. ASEAN, for example, where we expect a reasonable growth outlook. And then there are certain parts of the Middle East, the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, where largely because of oil revenues, we're seeing very, very good economic growth. On the more challenging side, this is a recession that is coming along with very high levels of inflation. And so the proverbial stagflation scenario is something that I think is very unfamiliar to most market participants. I think the first half of 2023 is when we will see the worst of the economic slowdown. We see a quote unquote pivot from the Fed in early 2023. If the rest of the central banks around the world also stop raising interest rates, that could start to lay the foundation for better economic performance in the second half of the year.
What are the top risks facing the global economy in the year ahead?
I suppose the first risk that we worry about is, frankly, that the depth of the recession is much greater than we have anticipated. There is a risk central banks are forced to hike monetary policy throughout 2023. There is a risk inflation is now becoming a structural problem rather than just a cyclical problem. If we go back to the 1970s, we all know what can happen when inflation becomes, structurally embedded. Another risk is energy prices. Energy prices around the world have come down over the last couple of months, but there is always a risk that whether because of geopolitical events or because of supply chain problems, that energy prices head back towards the highs.
After Fed's aggressive 6 hikes, we hardly see the effect on either the inflation or employment due to the lags. How long will it take for those hikes to actually work?
For example, in the United States, I would describe the inflation that we are seeing as a demand shock. In other words, there is excess demand created by monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus. In Europe, I would argue that most of the inflation problem that we have is the result of a supply shock. Now, I think important to highlight that monetary policy, even if you're hiking aggressively, works very differently, or the effectiveness is very different, depending on whether you're fighting a demand shock or a supply shock. Because the US is experiencing demand-led inflation, that monetary tightening should work to reduce that inflation. But as you point out correctly, it's taking longer than I think anybody would have expected.
US dollar tumbled recently amid the sign that the inflation may have peaked. What is your expectation for the dollar in the year ahead?
We've seen a little bit of evidence of that over the last week or two. I think it's too early to say whether that will be sustained. But I think it's really interesting to focus on the fact that the minute the market starts to look at when the Fed might stop raising interest rates, the dollar starts to weaken. So that tells you the relationship is very strong. I would anticipate that by Q1 of next year, we will have a very good understanding of where the Fed is in terms of their rate hiking cycle. And that should give quite a bit of support to a number of currencies around the world, both in the G10 and in emerging markets.